They laughed at the quiet cowboy who built a strange wall too close to his cabin, saying it was useless, paranoid, a waste of wood. They didn't know he was listening to the wind the way other men listened to warnings. They didn't know the storm was already on its way, and when the cold finally came, hard enough to steal breath, power, and hope, it was that forgotten cabin on the edge of town that refused to fall. Because sometimes survival isn't loud. Sometimes it's built quietly, board, by someone the world stopped paying attention to. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Cody. Wyoming was the kind of town that didn't pretend to be gentle. The land rose high and stayed there, exposed to every mood the sky cared to throw at it. Even in early fall, the cold arrived without apology. Mornings carried a sharp, dry chill that cut through denim and canvas alike, and the wind never truly rested. It only changed direction, as if testing which structures and people were worth sparing. The town itself clung together along a single stretch of road, a feed store with a sagging awning, a diner whose windows rattled whenever a truck passed, a gas station that smelled of diesel and burned coffee. Beyond that, the land opened wide and empty, rolling into pale grasslands and scattered sagebrush. Out there, mistakes didn't announce themselves. They waited. Elias Crow arrived on a morning when the sky was cloudless and misleading. The sun was bright, but it carried no warmth, only glare. He drove an aging dually pickup with dulled green paint and rust blooming along the wheel wells. The truck sounded solid, low and steady, like it had learned how to survive by refusing to complain. In the bed were stacked planks of treated lumber, bundled wire fencing, and a metal toolbox scarred by years of use. Elias was 33, tall without being imposing, lean in a way that came from long days of physical work rather than time spent in a gym. His shoulders were broad, his frame balanced, built for endurance. A short, dark beard traced the line of his jaw, kept neat but unstyled. His face was angular, weathered just enough to suggest experience rather than age. His eyes, gray, almost colorless in certain light, rarely moved quickly. They observed, measured, then settled. People would later say he had the look of a man who didn't expect the world to be fair, and therefore wasn't often surprised when it wasn't. Beside him sat his dog, Ridge, an Australian cattle dog mix with a stocky build and a mottled blue-gray coat. A single tan marking sat above his left eye, giving him a permanently skeptical expression. Ridge was 5 years old, disciplined but not stiff, the kind of dog that watched before reacting. His ears were always alert, angled toward the horizon rather than the cab. Elias turned off the main road and followed a narrow dirt track that climbed toward a neglected property north of town. The land there had been abandoned for long enough that rumors had grown comfortable in the silence. The previous owner had left after a brutal winter, and no one had been eager to take his place. The cabin came into view, a small, squared structure with a corrugated metal roof and log walls darkened by years of exposure. The porch sagged slightly. A barn stood a short distance away, its roof patched and uneven. The fencing leaned in places, surrendering inch by inch to gravity. Elias stopped at the gate and stepped out. The wind pressed immediately against his coat, finding seams and weak spots. He didn't rush. He stood still for a moment, eyes closed, letting the cold settle against his skin. He took in the sound of it, the steady hiss through dry grass, the low whistle around the cabin corners. Ridge jumped down and began circling, nose low, reading the ground. Elias walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching over frozen dirt. He paused on the north side of the cabin and pulled a narrow ribbon from his pocket, tying it to a nail he drove into the log wall. The ribbon snapped hard, pulling straight toward the open plain. He watched it for a long moment. Most men would have started with repairs, patched the roof, reinforced the porch, sealed the windows. Elias unloaded lumber instead. He stacked the boards carefully, measured the distance from the cabin wall, and drove the first post into the earth. Then another. Then another. The line ran parallel to the cabin, close enough to seem unnecessary, far enough to look deliberate. By late morning, the sound of a truck slowed on the road below. Vernon Pike leaned out of his window, squinting up the slope. Vernon was in his early 50s, thick-set, with a face permanently flushed from wind and habit. He wore a stained cap pulled too far back, revealing thinning hair that had long since surrendered to the elements. He had lived in Cody his whole life and considered that a qualification. He watched Elias hammer posts into the ground, the narrow gap between the cabin and the new line of wood immediately catching his attention. "Well, I'll be damned," Vernon called. "What are you building there, friend? Fence your house in so it doesn't wander off?" Elias didn't stop working. He tamped dirt around a post, checked it with a level, then finally looked up. "Something like that," he said. Vernon laughed, loud and easy. "That's a tight squeeze. You planning to keep the wind out or invite it over for dinner?" Elias glanced at the ribbons snapping against the cabin wall. "Wind's already invited," he replied. "Just needs to be told where to go." Vernon shook his head, grinning as if he'd been given a gift. "You're going to be real popular at the diner," he said, then rolled his window up and drove on, slowing again before the bend to get one last look. Elias went back to work. He moved with patience, every motion controlled. He didn't rush, and he didn't second-guess himself. Each board went up according to plan. By afternoon, the temperature dropped another degree, and the wind sharpened. Elias worked through it, stopping only to drink from a dented metal canteen. Ridge sat nearby, watching the open land to the north, body still but alert. A white utility truck arrived later in the day, climbing the track slowly. It parked with its nose angled away from the wind. The driver stepped out, a woman in her late 30s, medium height, strong build, dressed for work rather than appearance. Her name was Maribel Hayes. She was a veterinarian who covered the surrounding ranches, known for her steady hands and her refusal to dramatize situations that didn't need it. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a practical ponytail, her skin lightly tanned and weathered. Her eyes were brown, sharp, observant, the kind that noticed limps and inconsistencies. She carried a canvas medical bag slung over one shoulder. She approached Elias without calling out, stopping a few feet away. "You must be the new owner," she said. Elias set his hammer down and turned to face her. "Elias Crow." "Maribel Hayes." She extended her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "I handle livestock out here." Ridge approached her cautiously, sniffed her boots, then accepted a brief scratch behind the ear. Maribel's gaze shifted to the structure taking shape around the cabin. She studied the spacing, the alignment, the way the posts followed the cabin's footprint. "That's close," she said. "Most folks don't build that tight unless they're trying to trap something." "I'm trying to redirect," Elias replied. She nodded slightly. "Wind?" "Yes." Maribel glanced north, then back at the ribbon snapping against the wall. "You expecting trouble?" Elias hesitated, then answered honestly. "I don't expect easy." She considered that, then reached into her truck and returned with a thermos. "Coffee?" she said. "Cold day." "Appreciate it," Elias said. Maribel watched him work for a few minutes longer, noting the care he took to measure and align each board. "People will talk," she said as she turned to leave. "They always do." She smiled faintly. "If you're wrong, they'll forget. If you're right, they'll remember." As she drove away, the wind rose again, stronger this time. Elias drove the next post into the ground, the sound of the hammer echoing against the cabin walls. Ridge sat facing north, unmoving. By the time the light began to fade, the first section of the barrier stood firm, circling part of the cabin like a quiet promise. Elias stepped back, assessing the line, the distance, the way the wind moved through the narrow space and lost some of its force. He nodded once. This wasn't madness. It was preparation. And out here, preparation was the difference between being laughed at in the fall and being alive in the winter. The next morning, Cody arrived with the same bright, useless sun and a colder edge in the air, as if the night had sharpened everything while people slept. Elias Crow woke before dawn, the way some men wake before alarms, by habit, by a body trained to mistrust comfort. The cabin was quiet except for the faint ticking of the stove cooling from the night before. He pulled on his jeans and heavy shirt, slipped into his boots, and stepped outside with Ridge at his heel. The dog's paws made soft impressions in the frost, and his breath came out in short, steady clouds. Ridge didn't bark. He didn't need to. He simply watched the north like it was a job with no lunch break. Elias walked the half-built barrier in the gray light, checking every post with a hand that knew how to find weakness. The line held. The boards he'd installed yesterday were square and tight, spaced with intention. In the narrow corridor between cabin and barrier, the wind behaved differently. Still present, still cold, but less violent. It didn't slam. It slid, losing some of its bite as it was forced to move through the constraints Elias had imposed. The difference wasn't dramatic in a way that would impress a man driving by at 20 miles an hour. It was subtle, like the difference between a door left open and a door pulled nearly shut. Subtle things were what kept you alive. He made coffee on the old propane burner and drank it outside, letting the cold keep him honest. Then he went to work. He didn't hammer aimlessly or chase speed. He measured, cut, and fitted boards the way a saddler fits leather, tight enough to matter, not so tight it would split when the weather turned. Mid-morning, a second truck came up the road, not slowing out of curiosity like Vernon Pike's had, but climbing with purpose. A dark red Ford with a stock rack on the back stopped near the gate. The driver climbed out slowly, as if saving his joints for later. He was a man in his late 60s, tall but slightly bowed, with a face lined deep like dry creek beds. His mustache was thick and gray, trimmed carefully, the kind of mustache a man doesn't grow by accident. He wore a brown coat that had once been nicer, and his hat sat low over pale eyes that didn't waste time. This was Wade Harlan. Folks in Cody said Wade had been ranching longer than most of them had been alive. They also said he was hard to please and harder to move once he made up his mind. A few years back, Wade had lost his oldest son in a rollover on a winter road, and since then his voice had gotten quieter and his patience shorter. He wasn't mean, exactly. He just didn't spend energy on anything that didn't return something useful. Wade stood at the gate, looking at Elias's work without comment. Ridge watched him with the cautious neutrality of a dog who understood that old men could be dangerous in unexpected ways. "You're Crow," Wade said finally. His voice was low, sandpapered by age and wind. Elias set down his saw. "Yes, sir." Wade nodded once, eyes tracking the barrier. "Maribel mentioned you yesterday, said you're building close." Elias didn't correct him. Close was the point. "I am." Wade stepped a few paces closer, boots crunching frost. He didn't smile, but he didn't sneer either. "Why?" Elias considered him. There were men who asked questions because they wanted an audience. Wade asked questions the way he'd check the oil in a truck, because ignoring basics got expensive. "Windbreak," Elias said. "Not just to block, to redirect it, slow it down before it hits the cabin." Wade's pale eyes narrowed. "You think we're getting another of those winters?" Elias didn't answer with certainty he couldn't prove. "I think the pattern's off." Wade looked toward the north, where the sky was clean and blue in a way that felt too thin. "Patterns always look off if you stare long enough," he said, but his tone didn't carry dismissal. It carried worry, carefully disguised as skepticism. "You ever ranched up here?" "Montana," Elias said. "Different land, same kind of cold." Wade studied him, catching the trimmed beard, the steady eyes, the lack of fidgeting. "You work like a man who's seen consequences," he said. Elias's jaw tightened for a fraction, then eased. "I pay attention," he replied. Wade grunted, as if that was the only answer worth keeping. He hooked a thumb toward his truck. "I got a heifer calving early. Maribel's coming later. Thought I'd see who moved into the dead place before the snow does." "I'm not planning to leave," Elias said. Wade's gaze flicked to the barn roof and the leaning fence line. "You'll find out quick why the last man did." He turned to go, then paused. "Wind's not the only thing that kills out here." Elias watched him drive away, the stock rack rattling lightly. The old rancher had come to measure the newcomer, and Elias understood why. In places like this, you didn't just inherit property. You inherited risk. Elias went back to work. By noon, he had the west side framed, the board set with gaps that looked careless if you didn't know what you were looking at. They weren't careless. They were control points, places where the wind could bleed off pressure instead of building it like a fist. Between boards, he installed angled slats that would force gusts to rise and roll rather than slam straight into the cabin wall. Ridge stayed close until a new sound cut through the wind, hooves, slow and heavy. Elias looked up to see a horse approaching from the direction of the road, riderless, moving with the stiff caution of an animal that didn't trust the day. The horse was a gelding, chestnut with a dark mane and a white blaze down his face. He wasn't young, maybe 12, 13. His ribs not showing but visible under the coat. like a working animal fed enough to keep going and not much more. Frayed halter hung loose on his head, and he stopped 20 yards out, head lifted, nostrils flaring. Ridge rose immediately, hackles not up but posture rigid. Elias put a hand out without looking at him, palm down, steady. The dog stayed. The gelding watched Elias, then glanced toward the barn, ears rotating like satellite dishes. He took a step, then another. The wind shoved at his flank and he shifted his weight, uneasy. Horses didn't wander up here for no reason. A spooked horse was a message. Elias walked slowly toward him, speaking quietly. "Easy," he murmured. His voice wasn't soft in a gentle way. It was controlled, the tone used around animals that had learned fear. The horse's eyes rolled white for a second, then settled as Elias reached the halter and took hold. A brand scarred the horse's shoulder, Harlan's mark. Elias studied the frayed halter strap. It had been cut, not broken. That suggested panic or human hands. Either way, it meant trouble nearby. He led the horse to the barn, Ridge following at a respectful distance. Inside, the barn smelled of old hay and dry wood. Elias tied the gelding to a post, checked him for injuries, and found nothing beyond scraped fetlocks and a shallow cut on the chest. Nothing life-threatening. But the horse's trembling told a different story. Something had chased him, or something had happened fast enough to tear him out of a pasture. Elias was still examining the cut when Maribel Hayes's white truck came up the track, tires crunching. She stepped out with the same practical readiness as yesterday, her ponytail tucked into her jacket collar. Today she looked more tired, faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind of fatigue that came from late-night calls and early morning responsibility. She saw the horse and quickened her pace. "That's Wade's gelding," she said, already reaching into her medical bag. "Name's Bishop. He's steady. He doesn't bolt unless something's wrong." Elias nodded. "Halter looks cut." Maribel's brow tightened. "Or caught on wire and tore," she said, but her eyes said she understood what he meant. She moved in close, her hands confident as she checked Bishop's cut, palpated the leg joints, and listened for breathing irregularities. Bishop shifted, nervous, then settled under her touch. "He's stressed," she said, "but he's not broken." Elias leaned against a stall post, watching her work. "Any chance Wade had him loaded up and he got loose?" Maribel shook her head. "Wade doesn't leave halters frayed like that. He's picky, always has been." She looked up at Elias. "Where'd you find him?" "Coming from the road, alone." Maribel exhaled slowly as if bracing. "I was headed to the Harlan place anyway," she said. "Early calving. If Bishop ran, that means the pasture's in chaos or the gate's open." She paused. "Or the wind did something stupid." Elias's gaze flicked toward the north. The air felt sharper now, not colder exactly, more tense. "Wind doesn't cut halters," he said. Maribel didn't argue. She packed away a vial and wrapped the shallow cut with practiced efficiency. "I'll take him back," she said. "But I might need help. Roads are dry, but the gusts are getting ugly on the ridge." Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed a lead rope and walked Bishop out. Ridge followed, eyes alert, tail low, ready. They loaded Bishop into Maribel's stock trailer. Maribel secured the latch and looked at Elias's barrier again, this time with more focus than curiosity. "You're serious about this," she said. "I don't build for attention," Elias replied. Maribel studied his face, the hard angles softened only by restraint. "Wade will ask why you're doing it," she said. "He doesn't believe in projects without reasons." Elias gave a short nod. "I'll tell him what he needs to know." Maribel opened her truck door, then paused. "You coming?" she asked. Elias glanced at his half-built wall, then at the north sky. "I'll follow," he said. "In my truck." The drive down to the Harlan ranch took 15 minutes. The land opened wider as they descended, and the wind hit harder in exposed stretches, buffeting Elias's truck and shaking Maribel's trailer. Ahead, the Harlan property looked busy. Lights on in the barn, figures moving. Elias parked near the main barn and stepped out into the smell of livestock and cold metal. Inside, Wade Harlan stood over a heifer lying in straw, flanked by his ranch foreman and Wade's daughter, Tessa Harlan. Tessa was in her early 30s, tall and wiry, with sun-browned skin and blonde hair shoved under a knit cap. Her eyes were a pale blue that carried exhaustion and stubbornness. She moved quickly, efficient, but there was tension in the way she held her shoulders, as if she carried too many responsibilities and refused to set them down. The foreman, Cal Dorsey, was mid-40s, broad, with a blunt beard and hands like shovels. He had the steady demeanor of a man who didn't panic but expected others to. Cal's gaze sharpened when he saw Elias, taking him in from boots to beard like he was weighing a tool. Maribel strode in, already giving instructions. "Bishop's okay, Saul," she called to Wade. "He got loose, minor cut. I stitched and wrapped." Wade's head snapped up. His eyes landed on Elias. "You found my horse," Wade said, voice controlled. Elias nodded. "He wandered up my way." Tessa's gaze flicked between them. "Why was he up there?" she asked, tone suspicious, not unkind. "That pasture's fenced." Elias kept his voice even. Halter looked cut. Cal Dorsey's jaw tightened. "Coyotes don't cut halters." "No," Elias said. "People do. Or panic does." Wade stared at Elias for a long moment, the old rancher's face unreadable. Then he said quietly, "Storm's coming." It wasn't phrased as a question. It was the kind of statement a man made when he had stopped pretending he could ignore what his bones already knew. Maribel met Elias's eyes briefly, then looked back at Wade. "Pressure's dropping," she said. "Animals are acting wrong," and Bishop ran. Wade's gaze returned to Elias, and for the first time there was less skepticism in it, more calculation. "You building that wall because you think the wind's going to try to take your house apart," he said. Elias didn't oversell it. "I think we'll get a blow that finds weak points," he replied. "And once it finds them, it doesn't stop." Wade's mouth pressed into a line. Tessa turned away, focusing on the heifer, but Elias saw her shoulders stiffen at the word blow. Maybe she'd lived through a winter that taught her what wind could do to a roof, a barn, a family. Maribel finished checking the heifer, then stripped off her gloves. "She'll calve," Maribel said, "but keep her warm, and don't leave the barn doors open longer than you have to." Wade nodded, then looked at Elias one last time. "You got tools?" he asked. Elias answered without hesitation. "Yes." Wade's eyes narrowed. "And you got time?" Elias thought of his half-built barrier, the posts waiting. The wind outside the barn made a low, constant moan. "Depends," he said. Wade leaned in slightly, voice low enough that Cal and Tessa couldn't fully catch it. "If this gets worse fast, folks'll need somewhere to go. Your place is high and exposed. Mine's lower but full of animals. We'll both be in it. Don't build yourself a fortress and forget everyone else." Elias held his gaze, not flinching. "I'm not building to shut people out," he said. Wade studied him, then gave a small, approving nod that looked like the closest thing to trust he offered anyone. As Elias walked back out into the wind, the air felt different again. Still clear, still blue, but with a brittle tension that set teeth on edge. The day hadn't turned yet, but it had started to lean. Elias climbed into his truck, Ridge jumping into the passenger seat, and as they drove back toward the cabin, Elias already knew he would work faster tonight, not because Vernon Pike might laugh, not because people might talk, but because Bishop's wide eyes and Wade's quiet warning had confirmed what Elias had felt since he first stepped onto that land. The wind was getting hungry, and when it finally opened its mouth, it wouldn't care who believed in it. By the time Elias Crow reached his cabin again, the afternoon light had flattened into something pale and strained, as if the sun itself were being pressed thinner against the sky. The wind followed him up the track, persistent now, not gusting but steady, a continuous push that never fully let go. Ridge jumped from the truck and trotted a short circle, then stopped, facing north. His ears stayed upright, angled forward, the way they did when he sensed something that didn't yet have a sound. Elias stood for a moment with his hands on the truck door, listening. Wind moved differently along the half-built barrier than it had the day before. It slipped, hissed, lost momentum, then gathered again beyond the structure, as if confused by resistance. Elias felt it in his chest more than his skin. The air carried weight. That was the difference. Cold could be endured. Weight meant pressure, and pressure meant change. He didn't waste the remaining daylight. He went straight to work, setting the next run of boards along the south side. Unlike the north wall, this section was designed less to block and more to guide. He angled the slats slightly outward, a subtle adjustment that would encourage the wind to climb rather than strike flat. It was the kind of detail most people missed because it didn't announce itself. Elias checked each angle with a small brass inclinometer he kept in his pocket, a tool worn smooth from years of use. Ridge stayed close, shifting positions as Elias moved, occasionally lifting his nose to test the air. Once he gave a low, uncertain whine. Not fear, just discomfort. Elias paused and rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck. The muscle there was tense, the skin warm beneath the fur. "I know," Elias murmured. "It's changing." When the light finally gave out, Elias secured his tools and stepped inside. The cabin warmed slowly, the stove ticking and popping as it adjusted. Elias sat at the small table and pulled out a battered notebook. He flipped through pages filled with measurements, rough diagrams, and columns of numbers. At the back, taped carefully between pages, was a folded printout from a regional weather archive, old storm records, pressure readings, timelines. He compared yesterday's notes to today's and felt the tightness settle deeper in his chest. The drop wasn't dramatic yet, but it was consistent. Air didn't behave like this unless it was being displaced by something larger. He slept lightly and woke before dawn again, this time to a sound that wasn't wind. It was silence. A deep, muffled stillness that pressed against the cabin like a held breath. Elias sat up immediately. Ridge was already on his feet, standing rigid near the door. Outside, frost coated the ground thicker than the night before. The sky was low and colorless, not quite overcast but stripped of depth. Elias exhaled and watched the vapor sink rather than rise. That was new. He made coffee, pulled on his coat, and drove. Down into Cody. He needed supplies, and more importantly, he needed to hear what people were saying when they weren't being careful. The town was already awake. Trucks lined the street outside the diner and the smell of frying grease drifted through the cold. Elias parked near the feed store and stepped inside first. The bell over the door rang sharply. Behind the counter stood Howard Lyle, the store's owner. Howard was in his early 40s, tall but stooped, with narrow shoulders and a face that always looked a little apologetic, even when he wasn't. His beard was patchy and untrimmed, giving him a perpetually unfinished appearance. Howard had inherited the store from his father, who had run it with a harder hand. Since then, Howard had tried to soften things, longer hours, easier credit. It had earned him gratitude and debt in equal measure. Howard looked up. "Morning," he said. "Cold one." "Colder than it should be," Elias replied. Howard gave a small shrug. "That's Wyoming." He paused, then added, "Though, radio's been acting odd. Forecast keeps updating." Elias didn't comment. He walked the aisle, selecting hardware deliberately. Additional treated lumber, metal brackets, rolls of reflective barrier, bags of dense insulation meant for agricultural use. Howard raised his eyebrows as the pile grew. "Working fast," Howard said, ringing items up. "You're that guy building the fence real close to his house, right?" Elias met his gaze calmly. "Barrier." Howard hesitated, then nodded as if correcting himself. "Barrier?" he repeated. "Well, folks are talking." "They always do." Howard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Sheriff came by yesterday, asked if I'd noticed anyone buying generators or fuel in bulk." Elias stilled. "What'd you tell him?" Howard sighed. "The truth, that half the town's been buying heaters and propane like winter's coming to eat us alive." He glanced at Elias. He didn't laugh. That was new. Elias paid, loaded the supplies, and crossed the street to the diner. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, thick with the smell of bacon and coffee. The room was crowded, voices overlapping. Vernon Pike sat at the counter, already halfway through a plate of eggs. When he spotted Elias, he grinned. "Fence man," Vernon called. "You reinforcing it now?" Elias ignored the comment and took a seat at an empty booth. A waitress approached, a woman in her late 50s named Gloria Finch, short and round, with iron-gray hair pulled into a bun. She had lived in Cody longer than most and treated everyone with the same blunt efficiency. Gloria set a mug of coffee down without asking. "You look like you need it," she said. "Thanks." As Elias drank, he listened. A rancher at the counter complained about calves refusing to leave the barn. Another mentioned a weather app glitching, pressure readings dropping faster than usual. A third, joked about how his dog wouldn't stop pacing. The laughter sounded thin. The diner door opened and Sheriff Tom Calder stepped inside. Calder was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a square face and a neatly trimmed beard flecked with gray. His uniform sat on him comfortably, not stiff with authority. Years earlier, he'd lost his wife to cancer, and since then, his demeanor had changed, less talkative, more attentive. He nodded to a few people and ordered coffee, then his eyes landed on Elias. Calder approached the booth. "Mind if I sit?" Elias gestured to the opposite seat. "Go ahead." Calder studied him for a moment. "You're Elias Crow?" "Yes." "Sheriff Tom Calder." He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he wrapped both palms around his mug. "You've been busy." "So I'm told." Calder's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Wade Harlan mentioned you last night. Said you pay attention." Elias waited. Calder continued. "Pressure's dropping across the county. Weather Service says it's nothing yet, but they're revising language every few hours. I don't like that." Neither did Elias. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Calder met his gaze squarely. "Right now, nothing, but I'd like to know what you're seeing, off the record." Elias considered, then spoke carefully. "Air's heavy. Patterns don't match a normal front. Animals are reacting early. That usually means we get hit harder than expected." Calder nodded slowly. "That matches what I'm hearing." He stood. "If things shift quick, I may come by." Elias inclined his head. "I'll be there." After breakfast, Elias left town and drove back up the track, the truck straining slightly against the wind. When he reached the cabin, he unloaded supplies and worked steadily through the afternoon. He added the reflective barrier between boards, sealed seams, reinforced posts. Ridge followed every movement, occasionally pausing to stare at nothing in particular, hackles lifting for a second before settling again. Late in the day, a vehicle approached, smaller than a truck, slower. It was a dusty sedan, and it stopped at the gate uncertainly. A man stepped out, thin, mid-30s, with nervous hands and wire-frame glasses. His jacket was too light for the cold. "My name's Jonah Reed," the man said, voice tight. "I live down the road. I heard you know about weather." Jonah worked at the local school as a maintenance assistant. He was quiet, often overlooked, and had a habit of worrying things to death before anyone else noticed them. He had grown up in Tornado Alley and never fully shook the habit of watching skies. "My basement flooded last winter," Jonah continued. "Pipes froze. I can't afford that again. People say you're building something different." Elias looked at him, at the thin jacket, the anxious eyes. "I'm building to slow the wind," he said. "That's all." Jonah swallowed. "Do you think we should leave town?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He chose honesty over reassurance. "I think people should be ready," he said. Jonah nodded, relief and fear mingling. "Thank you," he said quietly, then returned to his car. As dusk fell, Elias finished the day's work. The barrier now wrapped more than half the cabin, the corridor between structures narrowing the wind's aggression. Elias stood back and watched how drifting dust moved differently now, how it curved instead of striking straight. Inside, he made a simple meal and listened to the weather radio. The voice on the other end sounded calm but cautious, words chosen carefully. Unseasonal pressure system, potential for rapid intensification, residents advised to monitor conditions closely. Ridge lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes open. Elias shut off the radio and sat quietly. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasted time, but he felt the urgency settle deeper, solid and undeniable. Tomorrow, he would finish the barrier, and then he would start preparing for what came after. Outside, the wind resumed its steady push, testing the edges of the structure Elias had built. It didn't break through. Not yet. The morning broke without color. Not gray, not white, just empty, as if the sky had been scrubbed too hard and left raw. Elias Crow stepped outside before sunrise and felt it immediately. The wind was still there but muted, held down by something heavier above it. The air no longer moved freely. It pressed. That was worse. Ridge stood beside him, body rigid, tail low. The dog's breathing was shallow, his attention fixed northward. He had not slept much. Neither had Elias. When animals refused rest, it meant their instincts had crossed a threshold logic couldn't yet reach. Elias walked the length of the barrier, now nearly complete. Frost had settled along the boards, outlining every seam and slat in white. Where the wind slipped through, the frost thinned. Where pressure built, it thickened. Elias read it the way other men read gauges. He knelt, adjusted one angled panel, tightened a bracket, then stood and watched the air correct itself. The structure wasn't fighting the wind, it was teaching it how to move. By mid-morning, clouds began to form, not rolling in, not advancing like a front, but assembling overhead layer by layer until the sky felt close enough to touch. Elias loaded the truck with the last of the insulation and metal sheets. He had planned to finish the barrier by nightfall. He no longer believed nightfall would wait for him. He was fastening the final section along the east side when he heard an engine straining uphill. Not a truck. Something smaller. He turned as a motorcycle crested the track slowly, tires fighting loose gravel. The rider stopped at the gate and cut the engine. The man removed his helmet carefully, like someone who respected his own fragility. He was in his early 40s, lean to the point of sharpness, with a long face and deep-set eyes that had seen too much sky. His hair was dark, threaded with premature gray, pulled back into a short tie at the nape of his neck. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down toward his cheekbone, old and clean, the kind left by accidents rather than violence. He wore a weathered leather jacket and gloves worn thin at the fingertips. "My name's Cole Mercer," he said, voice even but tight. "I fly crop surveys out of Powell." Elias wiped his hands on his jacket. "You're far from Powell." Cole nodded. "I diverted." He gestured upward. "Something's wrong up there." Cole wasn't a talker by habit. He chose his words carefully, like fuel rationed in bad weather. He explained that during an early flight, he'd noticed an unusual compression layer forming over the basin, pressure stacking faster than forecasts suggested. His onboard instruments, older, analog, stubbornly reliable, were behaving in ways he didn't like. He'd landed early and ridden out to find Elias Crow because Wade Harlan had mentioned a man building against the wind. "I've flown storms before," Cole said, eyes flicking to the sky. "This one doesn't behave like storms. It settles." Elias listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, Elias said only, "You're not wrong." Cole exhaled sharply, relief crossing his face. "Good," he said, "because if I'm wrong, I go home. If I'm right, people need to start closing doors." Elias looked at the barrier, then at Cole. "They won't," he said, "not until it's too late." Cole studied the structure, appreciation replacing skepticism. "That's not a fence," he said. "That's airflow management." "Yes." Cole nodded once. "I'll ground my plane," he said. "No sense flying blind." He hesitated. "If you hear anything, if this thing breaks open fast, I'll let you know," Elias replied. Cole replaced his helmet and rode off, the motorcycle disappearing into the low horizon. Elias returned to work, urgency sharpening his movements. He worked through lunch, through the creeping dark that came too early. Ridge followed, alert, occasionally growling at nothing Elias could see. By late afternoon, snow began, not falling but drifting sideways, fine and dry, the kind that didn't accumulate so much as infiltrate. Elias sealed the final seam and stepped back. The barrier was complete. It wrapped the cabin tightly, leaving the narrow corridor intact, every angle and gap intentional. He didn't celebrate. He went straight to the barn. Inside, he rolled out the remaining insulation, stacked fuel, checked the generator, and tested the emergency lighting. He secured the barn doors with extra latches, then moved to the small storage shed where he kept water containers. He filled the last one just as the first real gust hit, hard enough to rattle the metal siding. The radio crackled to life on its own. "Updated advisory. Rapid intensification. Severe wind event expected within 12 hours. The voice was controlled, but Elias heard the strain beneath it. He shut the radio off and moved back to the cabin. It was nearly dark when headlights appeared at the gate. A pickup this time. Sheriff Tom Calder stepped out, coat buttoned high, hat pulled low. The wind tugged at him, but he planted his boots like a man who'd learned how not to be moved. "You were right," Calder said without preamble. Elias didn't ask about what. "How fast?" "Faster than we like," Calder replied. "States issuing warnings but not evacuations. They're behind." "They always are." Calder glanced at the barrier. People are asking questions. Let them. Calder's jaw tightened. I've got elderly folks in town, trailers, bad heating. If this turns ugly, Elias met his gaze. My place can hold some, he said. Not all. Calder nodded. That may be enough. They stood for a moment in the rising wind, two men measuring responsibility. Then Calder turned back toward his truck. I'll be in touch, he said. The night came down hard after that. Wind screamed across the open land, testing every structure in its path. Elias stayed inside, monitoring the corridor between the barrier and the cabin. The air moved as designed, fast above, slower below, pressure broken into manageable pieces. The cabin groaned but held. Around midnight, headlights cut through the blowing snow again. This time, it was Maribel Hayes. She stepped out wrapped in a heavier coat than before, her hair pulled tight, face pale from cold and worry. Wade sent me, she said, breath fogging. Calving went wrong, power flickered, and the animals. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Elias brought her inside. The warmth hit immediately, surprising her. She looked around, noticing the even temperature, the absence of drafts. This works, she said quietly. Yes. She removed her gloves, flexed her fingers. People are going to need this. Elias nodded. They will. Maribel hesitated, then said, You don't owe them. Elias looked at her, expression steady. I know. Outside, the wind howled louder, furious now, no longer patient. Snow slammed against the barrier and rose, curling upward instead of crashing into the cabin walls. Elias watched the movement through a small, reinforced window, tracking patterns. The storm had arrived, and the land had stopped answering to anyone who hadn't prepared. The wind did not arrive all at once. It tightened, like a hand closing slowly around a throat, testing how much resistance it would meet before committing to the squeeze. Elias Crow stood at the reinforced window just after midnight, watching snow lift from the ground and fold back on itself, moving sideways rather than down. The barrier did what it was built to do. Gusts struck, broke apart, and slid upward, robbed of their clean violence. The cabin answered with low creaks, wood talking to wood, but it did not shudder. Maribel Hayes sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes following the same invisible lines Elias tracked. She had seen storms before, calving seasons that turned brutal overnight, highways shut by ice. But this one carried a different posture. It leaned in. It waited. Power's gonna go, she said. Not fear. Assessment. Yes, Elias replied. He checked the generator readout and the fuel line one more time. When it does, it won't come back quickly. Ridge lay near the door, chin on his paws, eyes open. His breathing was steady, but his ears twitched constantly, adjusting to sounds humans couldn't separate. He was a working dog, 5 years old and already marked by seasons that taught him when to rest and when to stay awake. At 1 a.m, the lights flickered. At 1:03, they went out for good. The generator kicked in without hesitation, the hum deep and reassuring, like a large animal settling into its stride. Elias watched the system stabilize, then turned the radio back on. The voice that answered was clipped and stripped of softness. Widespread outages, travel strongly discouraged, emergency services limited. Maribel exhaled slowly. It started. It started in town, too. Down in Cody, the wind found the weak seams first. A loose sign ripped free from its bolts. A trailer's skirting tore away and vanished into the dark. Pipes began to freeze in homes where people trusted space heaters and hope. Sheriff Tom Calder moved from call to call, his truck fighting the roads, his jaw set hard. He knew who couldn't make it through a night like this without help. At 2:15, headlights appeared on Elias's track, crawling, stopping, crawling again. A truck stalled near the gate, engine whining. Elias pulled on his coat and stepped outside, the cold biting instantly. Snow struck his face like sand. He made it to the gate and saw Wade Harlan behind the wheel, his mustache rimmed with ice, eyes sharp despite the hour. "Lost power at the lower barns," Wade shouted over the wind. "Generators froze. I've got 2 hands injured and 1 old man who won't stop shaking." Elias didn't ask questions. He swung the gate open and guided the truck up to the barn, positioning it where the barrier stole the worst of the wind. Maribel was already moving, boots planted, voice clear as she directed Wade's people inside. They came in ones and twos at first. A ranch. Hand with a split lip and blood crusted on his beard. Cal Dorsey. His broad shoulders hunched against pain, but his eyes alert. An older man named Ernest Cole, in his 70s, skin pale, hands trembling uncontrollably, his breath shallow and uneven. Elias wrapped him in blankets and guided him to a chair near the stove, careful not to crowd him. More lights appeared. Sheriff Calder's truck, then another pickup. The storm had reached a point where choices collapsed into necessities. Calder stepped inside, coat dusted white, eyes scanning the room with practiced speed. "We've got folks in trailers losing heat fast," he said. "2 families from the South Ridge are on the way." Elias nodded. "Bring them." Maribel worked steadily, checking circulation, warming hands, murmuring reassurances that didn't promise what couldn't be delivered. She moved with the calm authority of someone who had learned, over years, that panic was contagious, but so was steadiness. By 3:30, the cabin and barn were full. 15 people in all, spread between the warm interior and the sheltered barn space. Children huddled together under coats too big for them. Adults spoke quietly, conserving energy, watching the wind claw at the world outside. A woman Elias hadn't met before sat near the door, her posture rigid. Her name was Sarah Lang. She was in her early 40s, tall and thin, with pale skin stretched tight from cold and stress. Her blonde hair had come loose from its braid, strands plastered to her cheeks. She worked nights at the diner, lived in a single wide with her teenage son. When the heat failed, she'd tried to ride it out. When the windows started frosting from the inside, she'd packed and driven. "My boy's still with a friend," she said to Elias, voice steady but eyes wet. "I couldn't get to him." "He's safer staying put than on the road," Elias said. "We'll get him when this breaks." She nodded, trusting the certainty in his tone more than the words themselves. Outside, the wind escalated from force to fury. Snow piled against the barrier and rose, redirected upward in curling sheets. Where other structures would have taken the blow head-on, Elias's design bled it off in pieces. The corridor filled with moving air, warmer than the outside by degrees that mattered. The cabin stayed steady. At 4, a sound like a freight train passed overhead, a sustained roar that flattened thought. The building groaned. One of the children cried. Maribel knelt, speaking softly, counting breaths until the sound receded. Ridge stood and paced, then settled again, body pressed against the door as if adding his weight to the seal. By dawn, the storm showed no intention of easing. The radio confirmed what Elias already knew. This was not a single-night event. It would take time. When the wind dipped briefly mid-morning, Elias stepped out to assess damage. Snow had sculpted the barrier into smooth curves, proof of diverted force. He checked anchors, tightened a strap, and returned inside with his face burning from cold. Cal Dorsey approached him near the barn door. The foreman's beard was stiff with ice, his lips swollen. "I mocked this," Cal said quietly. "Told Wade it was overkill." Elias met his gaze. "People mock what they don't understand," he said. "It's cheaper than learning." Cal nodded once, accepting the rebuke. "You need help, say the word." "I will." By midday, another knock came, softer, hesitant. Jonah Reed stood outside, coat too light, glasses fogged, fear etched deep. Elias ushered him in without comment. Jonah sank onto a bench, shaking. "They told me to stay home," Jonah said. "The walls started cracking. I thought I was hearing things." "You weren't," Elias replied. The storm wore on. The generator held. The fuel line stayed clear. Elias rationed carefully, adjusting loads, moving people to keep warmth even. He slept in 20-minute pieces, waking at every shift in sound. That night, the wind returned to full force. But inside the barrier, life continued. Soup was heated. A child laughed at something small and silly. Sarah Lang closed her eyes and slept for the first time in hours. Elias stood again at the window, watching snow move the way water did under pressure. He felt no pride, no triumph, only relief, thin and temporary. The house held its breath, so did the people inside. And for now, that was enough. Morning did not arrive so much as announce itself by a slight easing of darkness. The storm still ruled the land, but the blackness thinned to a dull blue-gray, and shapes regained their edges. Elias Crow woke from a shallow sleep on the cabin floor, his back stiff, his mind already counting systems before his eyes fully opened. The generator's hum was steady. The stove's heat was consistent. No alarms. That alone felt like a victory. Ridge lifted his head as Elias rose. The dog's eyes were bloodshot from lack of rest, but his posture remained alert. His coat was dusted with snow crystals, carried in on boots during the night. Elias crouched and checked him briefly. Paws, ears, breathing. Ridge leaned into the contact, then returned to his post by the door. He understood that this was not a morning for wandering. Inside the cabin, people stirred quietly. 15 bodies shifted in limited space, learning how to move without colliding, how to share warmth without crowding. The air smelled of soup, damp wool, and wood smoke. Maribel Hayes moved among them with practiced calm, checking Ernest Cole's pulse, adjusting blankets, murmuring to a child whose dreams had turned restless. Her face showed the strain now, fine lines deepened around her eyes, but her hands remained steady. "Ernest's core temperature is holding," she said softly to Elias. "Slow improvement." "Good," Elias replied. He poured hot water into a thermos and handed it to Sarah Lang, who sat near the wall, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the window. Her thin frame looked almost folded into itself, but her jaw was set with stubborn resolve. "Any word from town?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "Radios are spotty. Sheriff's checking when he can." Outside, the wind surged again, testing the barrier with renewed aggression. Snow climbed the outer wall and peeled away upward, curling like smoke. Elias watched the pattern through the reinforced pane, noting where drift pressure increased. He made a mental adjustment. One panel would need reinforcing if the storm persisted another day. Near mid-morning, a new sound cut through the wind, metal clanging against metal, irregular and sharp. Elias tensed. Ridge growled low. Elias grabbed his coat and stepped outside, bracing against the cold. The sound came from the barn side. He rounded the corner and saw a figure struggling near the barn door, hands numb, movements clumsy. The man turned as Elias approached. He was in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, tall but underfed, his cheeks hollowed by stress rather than hunger. A scraggly beard clung to his jaw, uneven and untrimmed. His coat was torn at the sleeve, insulation spilling like dirty snow. His eyes were wide, unfocused. "Please," the man said hoarsely. "I saw the lights." Elias took his arm firmly but without force and guided him inside. "What's your name?" "Lucas Avery," the man said between breaths. "I was camping north of here." "Got stranded." Lucas had been a seasonal worker, drifting between construction jobs, living light and moving often. A sudden layoff months earlier had pushed him into the margins. He had learned to rely on himself and no one else, a habit that now nearly killed him. Maribel assessed him quickly, ushering him toward warmth. "Mild hypothermia," she said. "You're lucky." Lucas nodded weakly, shame and relief mixing on his face. "Didn't think the weather would turn like this." "Most people don't," Elias said. As Lucas warmed, Sheriff Calder's radio crackled to life on the counter. Elias answered immediately. "Crow," Calder's voice came through, distorted but urgent. "We've got a situation. Southridge trailer collapsed. 2 people trapped. Roads are impassable." Elias closed his eyes briefly, calculating. Distance, wind direction, time. "How far?" 3 miles, Calder replied. "But the drifts—" "I'll come," Elias said. Maribel looked up sharply. "It's dangerous." "So is waiting," Elias replied. He turned to Cal Dorsey, who stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw set. "You still mean it about helping?" Cal nodded without hesitation. "Tell me what to do." They prepared quickly. Elias layered clothing, checked fuel levels, secured a tow line and emergency supplies. Cal bundled up beside him, his movements deliberate despite the swelling on his lip. Ridge whined once, sensing departure. "You stay," Elias told the dog quietly. Ridge froze, ears back, then reluctantly lay down. He understood duty, even when he disliked it. The truck fought the wind like a living thing, tires slipping, engine strained. Elias drove by instinct and memory, reading drifts, adjusting speed. Cal watched the horizon, calling out hazards. They reached the collapsed trailer by feel more than sight. Metal lay twisted, snow packed hard against one side. 2 figures were trapped inside, an elderly couple, the woman conscious but panicked, the man barely responsive. They worked with numb hands, cutting through siding, clearing snow, shouting to keep the man awake. Elias moved with focused efficiency, blocking wind where he could, directing Cal with short commands. It took 40 minutes that felt like hours, but they freed the couple and loaded them into the truck. The return trip was slower. Wind screamed, snow thickened, visibility dropped to nothing. Elias leaned forward, knuckles white, trusting the barrier he'd studied for years, the way land dipped, the way snow stacked. When the cabin lights finally cut through the white, Cal let out a breath he'd been holding since they left. Inside, Maribel took over immediately, guiding the couple toward warmth, directing others to make space. The woman wept quietly as feeling returned to her hands. The man stirred, confused but alive. Elias stripped off his frozen coat and leaned briefly against the wall, exhaustion pressing in. He pushed it aside. There would be time later. As evening approached, the storm began to change character. The wind did not lessen, but its pitch shifted, losing some of its erratic violence. Elias recognized the pattern. This was not the end, but it was the turn. Maribel joined him near the window. "You didn't have to go," she said quietly. "Yes," Elias replied. "I did." She studied his profile, the sharp lines, the calm restraint. "You're used to carrying weight alone." Elias didn't deny it. "You learn to," he said. "After a while, it feels lighter than trusting it to someone else." She nodded, understanding more than he'd said. Late that night, the radio brought better news. Winds expected to remain severe, but snowfall tapering. Emergency crews staged outside the county, waiting for clearance. People slept more deeply now, exhaustion overtaking fear. Sarah Lang finally closed her eyes, clutching a borrowed blanket. Lucas Avery sat quietly, staring at his hands as if reacquainting himself with being alive. Elias made one last circuit of the barrier before resting. Snow had sculpted it into smooth arcs, proof of redirected force. He tightened a bolt, checked an anchor, then stood still, listening. The land was still dangerous, but it was no longer screaming. And that meant they had endured the longest hours, the ones before morning decided whether it would come at all. The storm did not end with drama. There was no sudden clearing, no triumphant sunrise. It loosened its hold the way a tired hand relaxes, slowly, reluctantly, as if unsure whether letting go was wise. Elias Crow noticed the change before dawn, waking to a silence that was not absence but distance. The wind still moved, but farther away, its voice dulled, its edges blunted. He lay still for a moment on the cabin floor, listening. The generator hummed evenly. The stove ticked with quiet patience. Somewhere near the barn, a loose panel tapped once, then stopped. Elias rose, joints stiff, and stretched carefully. His body felt older than his 33 years, but it was a familiar ache, the honest kind that came from effort, not damage. Ridge lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor. His eyes were clearer now, the constant tension easing just enough to allow curiosity back in. Elias scratched behind his ears. "We made it through the worst," he said quietly. Ridge accepted the words, if not fully believing them yet. Inside, the sheltering families began to wake. Movements were slower, heavier, like people returning from a long swim. Maribel Hayes sat at the table with a notebook, making careful notes as she checked on each person. Blood pressure, circulation, lingering tremors. Her hair had escaped its ponytail entirely, dark strands framing a face marked by exhaustion and resolve. She looked up when Elias entered. "No new complications," she said. "Ernest's breathing is stronger. The couple you brought in last night are stable. They'll need rest, not miracles." "That's enough," Elias replied. Sarah Lang stood near the stove, warming her hands, her posture less rigid than the day before. The sharp fear in her eyes had softened into something like guarded hope. "The radio said roads might open by evening," she said. "Is that true?" "Possibly," Elias said. "Not all at once." She nodded, then surprised him by smiling, small, tired, genuine. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. Elias shrugged. Storm didn't ask. By mid-morning, Sheriff Tom Calder arrived again, this time on foot from where he'd parked his truck down the slope. The wind was still strong enough to argue with engines. Calder's beard was rimmed with frost, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. But there was relief there too, faint but unmistakable. "County crews are staging," he said. "Plows from the east should reach town by tonight. We lost a few structures, but fewer people than we feared." "That's something," Elias said. Calder glanced around the barn and cabin, taking in the quiet order, the way people were spaced, the steady warmth. "You saved lives," he said plainly. Elias didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that gratitude was easier to carry when it wasn't turned into ceremony. Outside, Cal Dorsey and Wade Harlan stood together near the barrier, studying it in daylight. For the first time since the storm had reshaped everything, snow clung to the outer wall in sculpted ridges, smooth and deliberate, proof of redirected force. Wade ran a gloved hand along one section, nodding to himself. "This thing bled the wind off," Wade said. "Didn't fight it, just taught it where to go." Cal glanced at Elias, then back at the structure. "I've built fences my whole life," he said. "Never thought about wind like that." "Most people don't," Elias replied, "until it teaches them." Late morning brought another visitor, not in distress this time, but cautious and deliberate. A woman approached from the road, walking carefully over packed snow. She was in her early 60s, short and sturdy, with silver hair tucked beneath a wool hat. Her coat was old but meticulously mended. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had endured many winters and learned when to ask for help. Her name was Ruth Keller. She lived alone on the west edge of town and had spent most of her life teaching elementary school. Years earlier, she'd lost her husband to a heart attack during a particularly harsh winter, and since then, she'd developed a quiet vigilance toward weather. She stopped several paces from Elias and removed her gloves. "I wanted to see it," she said simply. Elias inclined his head. "You're welcome to look." She walked the barrier slowly, fingertips brushing the wood. "People talk," she said. "They always do, but they also remember who kept the lights on when everything else went dark." She turned to him, eyes sharp but kind. "You going to teach this?" Elias hesitated. Teaching meant staying. It meant roots. He'd spent years moving when things got heavy. "If people want to learn," he said finally. "They will," Ruth replied. "Fear makes good students." By afternoon, the wind dropped another notch. Snow no longer flew. It settled. Crews reached the outskirts of town, and radios buzzed with cautious optimism. One by one, people prepared to leave Elias's shelter, packing borrowed blankets, thanking Maribel, nodding respectfully at Elias. Lucas Avery lingered near the door, more, hands in his pockets. His beard was still uneven, his coat patched now with duct tape and borrowed thread. "I don't know where I'm going next," he said quietly, "but I won't forget this." Elias met his gaze. "Remember the signs," he said. "Weather speaks before it shouts." Lucas nodded and stepped out into the calmer cold. As the day wore on, Sarah Lang's son was brought up by a county truck, safe, cold, embarrassed by his fear, but alive. Sarah hugged him fiercely, tears freezing on her cheeks. She looked at Elias over her son's shoulder, gratitude too big for words. Near sunset, the last of the families departed. The barn fell quiet. The cabin echoed faintly with absence. Maribel sat heavily at the table, rolling her shoulders, fatigue finally claiming its due. "You could have left," she said, "before anyone arrived, before this became all of this." Elias leaned against the counter, watching the sky shift toward pale gold. "I didn't build it to be alone," he said. She studied him then, really studied him, the lines of strain and restraint, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to carrying responsibility without complaint. "You don't talk about why you know these things," she said. Elias considered the question, the memories it brushed against. "Loss teaches," he said simply. "If you listen." Maribel nodded. "Then maybe it wasn't wasted." That evening, Elias walked the barrier alone. Snow glowed softly in the fading light, and the structure stood firm, marked but unbroken. He checked anchors, brushed ice from vents, adjusted one panel where pressure had lingered longer than expected. Ridge followed, calmer now, occasionally bounding ahead to sniff the air before returning. The storm had taken things, structures, certainty, sleep. But it had also revealed something else. In the quiet that followed, Elias felt it settle. He was no longer invisible here. As darkness fell, lights flickered back on in the valley below, one by one. Elias stood on the porch, hands resting on the rail, and watched Cody reappear, scarred but breathing. He did not feel pride, he felt purpose, and for the first time in a long while, that felt enough. The land did not rush back to normal. It never did after storms like this. It healed slowly, as if deciding whether the people who remained deserved another chance. Elias Crow woke to a morning that felt almost gentle by comparison, cold still, but honest. The wind had dropped to a steady breath instead of a threat, and sunlight touched the snow without blinding glare. It was the kind of quiet that followed endurance, not peace. He stepped outside with Ridge at his side. The dog moved differently now, lighter, tail held higher, pausing to sniff rather than scan. His mottled blue-gray coat caught the light, frost melting into dark speckles along his back. Ridge was tired, but satisfied in the way working animals are when they've done what they were built to do. Elias walked the full perimeter of the barrier one last time, not searching for failure, but confirming survival. The structure bore scars, ice scoring the wood, packed snow frozen into sculpted curves, but it stood straight. The corridor between the cabin and the barrier was clear, airflow behaving exactly as intended. Nothing had collapsed, nothing had given way. The wind had come, tested it, and moved on. Down the slope, Cody was stirring back to life. Smoke rose from chimneys in cautious lines. A plow crawled along the main road, metal scraping ice. Radios crackled with updates that sounded more human now, less clipped, less careful. The worst was over. By mid-morning, vehicles began appearing again on Elias's track, but this time they came without urgency. Sheriff Tom Calder arrived first, boots crunching, shoulders less tense. He carried a clipboard under one arm, the symbol of order returning. "County's calling it a historic event," Calder said. "Damage assessments coming in. We're lucky." Elias nodded. "Luck favors preparation." Calder allowed himself a brief smile. "They want to hold a meeting tonight, town hall. People want to hear what you saw." "I'm not much for speeches," Elias said. "You don't have to give one," Calder replied. "Just answer questions." Behind Calder came Wade Harlan's truck, then Cal Dorsey's. Wade stepped out slower than usual, joints stiff, but his posture carried a weight that had shifted. He no longer looked like a man guarding his ground. He looked like one acknowledging shared territory. "I walked my north fence this morning," Wade said. "Lost 3 posts, but no stock." He glanced at the barrier. "That thing of yours saved more than your own skin." Cal folded his arms. "We're thinking about barns," he said. "Wind sleeves, brakes, something like this." Elias listened without interrupting. Teaching had already begun, whether he'd agreed to it or not. Maribel Hayes arrived later, carrying her medical bag out of habit rather than need. She looked rested for the first time since the storm began. Her hair was down, loose around her shoulders, and she moved with less urgency. "Clinic's open again," she said. "Minor injuries, stress cases, nothing catastrophic." "That's good," Elias said. Maribel studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You're going to be busy." "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe people will forget once it's warm again." She shook her head. "Not this time." By afternoon, Elias's property felt less like a refuge and more like a crossroads. Ruth Keller returned with a notebook tucked under her arm. She'd brought coffee and a quiet determination. "I've spoken with the council," she said. "They want to create a preparedness program, workshops, demonstrations. You wouldn't have to lead everything, just show people how to think about wind." Elias looked out toward the open land, remembering years of leaving before roots took hold. "I don't want this to turn into fear," he said. Ruth nodded. "It won't. Fear fades. Memory doesn't. If someone keeps it alive." Late afternoon brought one last visitor. A pickup stopped at the gate, smaller than most, paint faded to chalk. A man stepped out slowly, favoring one knee. He was in his late 40s, compact and muscular despite the limp, his beard trimmed short and gray at the edges. His face bore the calm severity of someone who had learned to move carefully after injury. "My name's Daniel Morse," he said. "I live east of town. Retired Army engineer." Elias's attention sharpened, not suspicion, recognition. "I lost my house in the storm," Daniel continued. "Bad angle. Wind caught it wrong. I watched your place hold." He gestured to the barrier. "You didn't just build a wall. You built margin." Daniel explained that a training accident years earlier had shattered his knee and ended his service. Since then, he'd lived quietly, fixing what he could, helping when asked. "I'd like to help," he said. "Teach with you, design with you." Elias studied him, the way he stood, balanced, despite injury, eyes clear. "We'll talk," Elias said. As the sun dipped low, People began drifting away again, back to their homes, their repairs, their routines. The land reclaimed its quiet. Only Maribel remained, sitting on the porch rail, boots dangling, watching the sky shift into evening. "You could leave?" she said lightly. "No one would blame you." Elias leaned against the post beside her. "I know." She glanced at him, measuring. "But you won't." "No," he said. "I think I'm done running from places that need work." Maribel smiled, not teasing this time. "Good," she said. "This place could use someone who listens." That night, Cody's town hall filled slowly. People arrived bundled and cautious, faces lined with fatigue and relief. Elias stood at the back at first, arms crossed, Ridge lying at his feet. Questions came about pressure, wind angles, insulation, preparation. Elias answered plainly. He didn't dramatize. He didn't simplify. He spoke the way he built, direct, intentional, without waste. By the end, the laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was lighter, grateful. Sheriff Calder shook his hand. Wade clapped him once on the shoulder. Ruth smiled like a teacher watching a lesson land. When Elias returned home under a clear sky scattered with stars, the barrier cast long shadows across the snow. He paused at the gate and looked back toward town, lights steady now, no longer flickering. Ridge trotted ahead, then stopped, waiting. Elias followed, boots crunching softly. Inside, the cabin was warm, quiet, not empty. Elias removed his coat, set it aside, and sat at the table. For the first time since arriving in Cody, he did not feel like a visitor measuring exits. He felt placed, useful, connected. Outside, the wind passed over the land without anger, diverted gently upward, continuing on its way. And the place Elias Crow had built did not resist the world. It endured it. And maybe the miracle wasn't the wall. Maybe it wasn't the storm turning away at the last moment. Maybe the miracle was this, that one quiet man chose to prepare instead of panic, to stay instead of run, to open his door when the world outside was freezing shut. Sometimes God doesn't send thunder or angels. Sometimes he sends wisdom early, patience when others laugh, and hands willing to build long before the danger is visible. In our own lives, we may never face a blizzard like this one, but we all face storms, moments when fear presses in, when help feels far away, when the world seems colder than it should be. And in those moments, perhaps faith is not about asking God to remove the storm, but trusting that he has already given us what we need to endure it, a skill, a warning, a neighbor, or the courage to be the shelter someone else is praying for. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may be walking through a cold season of their own. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your words may remind someone they are not alone, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of hope, resilience, and quiet miracles. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May he protect the children, the animals, and the forgotten. And may he bless every home that chooses compassion over fear. Amen.